Wisconsin is one of 26 states without right-to-work laws. Those laws say no one can be forced to join a union or pay union dues as a condition of employment. But Senate Majority Leader Scott Fitzgerald has said he hopes the Senate, our state Senate, will consider a right-to-work law for Wisconsin this year. To talk about this controversial proposal, I want to thank Scott Manley, Vice President for Government Relations of Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce, and Steve Lyons, an attorney and lobbyist for the Wisconsin Contractor Coalition. Gentlemen, thank you. Is there any more interesting, well, there's a lot of interesting issues out there, but right to work is certainly one of them, so I really appreciate you coming in. Scott, I have this question. I covered the campaign for governor last year. Right to work was not a central theme. I interviewed many dozens of legislative candidates, and it didn't emerge. Why are we debating right to work now, sir?
I think it's a couple reasons. I think we find ourselves in a unique point of history in terms of the pro-business majorities that have been elected to the Senate and the Assembly. Both houses picked up seats, and I think you could make an argument that, especially with respect to the Senate, that in addition to having more Republicans, that ideologically the body shifted to more of a conservative point of view. But I think beyond that, at least from our perspective, it's a policy that we need to do now if we want to remain economically competitive. Okay. And when we look at our some of our upper Midwest states like Michigan and Indiana that have recently gone right to work, I think this is a policy we need to do.
Those of us in the Capitol were surprised when Senate Majority Leader Fitzgerald said he'd like to make it a priority. He said that in December. Then in January, WMC, your employers, listed it as right at the top of its goals for this session. Steve, tell us about the Wisconsin Contractor Coalition, which is on record, let's just make that clear, against a right-to-work law in Wisconsin, right?
Correct, and I just want to make one clarification. I'm not an attorney.
Oh,
so
sorry.
That,
sorry.
We'll start there.
But you are a lobbyist for the...
Absolutely.
Okay.
So the Wisconsin Contractor Coalition is a coalition of private sector job creators all over the state, from Ashland to Janesville, La Crosse to Kenosha. Over 350, now getting close to 400 private sector businesses that employ thousands upon thousands of employees. And these are private sector, conservative, large and small business. Some of them employ thousands of folks that have come out and opposed this legislation for a number of reasons. But most importantly is they work with their unions in tandem. That's been a strong relationship between two private sector entities that enter into a voluntary contract, and they, in the unions in these particular instances, act as a really as a service to help with finding employment or finding folks to fill the job. So Payne and Dolan, which is one of our members, or J.P. Cullen, one of our members, will call the union and say, look, we just got a bid, we need 30 welders. The union will make sure they're drug tested, that they're certified, that they've been trained at one of the highly skilled facilities, and deliver those so we can continue to build roads and infrastructure and that. Now, asking the question, why now? We agree with Governor Walker, who has said this is a distraction. We agree with the Speaker of the Assembly, who has said and announced his forward agenda, and it's not on there. We agree with editorial after editorial after editorial, the Milwaukee Journal, the State Journal, the Racine Journal-Times, economist after economist who said this is a bad idea. So the drumbeat is getting louder and why this shouldn't be passed, and so the ranks are swelling, and it's private sector employers, private sector job creators that are opposing this.
Before I give Scott a chance to rebuttal, I have this question. You talked about the working relationship between members of your coalition and their unions. How would a right-to-work law disrupt that?
And I hear this from our members all the time. It would be disruptive in a couple different ways. One, it's a voluntary contract that they enter in right now. And it's been a system that has worked very, very well for these entities. So again, you look at Rock Roads with Bill Kennedy, and he'll call his folks, and they just got another bid, and they said, look, we need X amount of employees. And all of that is done so smoothly. You remove that, and they're going to have to make sure they're trained. They're going to have to make sure they're drug tested. They're going to have to do a lot of the work that the union in partnership delivers right now.
I see you shaking your head. You really want to rebut this. Go ahead, Scott.
Well, I mean, I think it's just simply not correct to assume that if you pass a right-to-work law that suddenly unions go away and that businesses can't have a relationship with unions. That hasn't been the experience anywhere in the United States, certainly not in any of the 24 right-to-work states. I mean, the reality is that this is just about giving workers the right to choose, do I want to be in a union and do I want to pay dues? It doesn't eliminate unions. It doesn't eliminate collective bargaining. And, you know, you talk about having a relationship with the union and you know, of course you can still have that. And that's going to be up to this is just about giving workers the freedom to choose. Now, when we look at what's happened in Indiana, for example, they went right to work in 2012. They've actually increased union jobs since passage of right to work. And, you know, I think it's because of the positive economic attributes that are often found in right-to-work states. Over the last 10 years, we found right-to-work states growing jobs at about twice the rate of non-right-to-work states, growing wages at about twice the rate of non-right-to-work states. And when you look at the cost of living differences from state to state, we find that when you make that adjustment, that workers typically have a disposable income that's about $2,000 higher in a right-to-work state as opposed to a non-right-to-work state. So, you know, I can certainly appreciate that there are businesses that have a good, you know, reputation and get along well with their union. There's absolutely nothing about right-to-work that would require that to change, and it hasn't in other states.
I just hang on for just a second.
Sure.
Hold that thought. Does WMC see a right-to-work law as an economic development or fundamental fairness, Scott?
Well, I think it's both. I mean, I think Mr. Lyons talked about these are voluntary agreements between unions and businesses. Who's left out of that agreement is workers, because they're the ones who are forced to pay dues under those so-called voluntary agreements. So I think it's a fundamental fairness issue. I think it's an individual freedom and an individual liberty issue where, you know, the question is, do we want to force workers to pay dues to organizations that they don't support or not? But we do see it as an economic development issue. And when you talk to the site selectors who advise businesses on where they want to invest in economic development projects, what site selectors will often say is that 75% of their clients will rate a state's right-to-work status as either being important or very important. And half of them will consider right-to-work as a pass-fail. So is right-to-work the only thing that businesses consider? Absolutely not. They consider tax climate, they consider regulatory climate, they consider energy costs, so many other factors. But right to work is one of those factors, and it's increasingly an important one.
Steve, thanks for your patience. All yours. The floor is yours.
A couple different things. In regard to the economics of this, and I'll dispute all of those numbers. First, let me start with the economic part of this. I want to make sure I read this correctly. I don't want to be misquoting anyone. This is from the spokesperson and the editor of National Right to Work Committee. We're not purporting to prove that right to work produces superior economic growth. They agree. They're saying, look, the numbers don't show whether it's a freedom issue or not, but on the finances, simply not there. In regard to site selection, and I've heard this a number of times, anecdotally, well, if you talk to a site selector, you know, they might tell you that there's an imaginary box that they check off whether they're going to move to that state or not. One of the most recent Site Selection magazine publications, November of 2014, listed the top 10 most important things for site selectors to choose where to go. I brought it today. I'll just read it real quickly. Things that you would think that companies would really care about. Transportation, infrastructure, ease of permitting, workforce skills, taxation, local taxation, availability of incentives. These are the things that companies care about. These are the things that my members are talking about. There's not an imaginary box that someone checks and say whether you're going to move to Wisconsin or not. And if that was the case, you wouldn't see Mercury Marine, who just moved from Oklahoma, a right-to-work state, back to Wisconsin, a non-right to work state, and creating their headquarters here, or Amazon, and the companies go on and on and on. And the reason being is because of all the things Wisconsin offers. Again, it's all the things that site selectors in documentation state are important to them. In regard to the numbers of what's important and the financials, we've done the same studies. We've looked at the same labor statistics, and one thing we have to be careful about, that averages are a very dangerous thing. And a lot of the statistics that were just talked about are averages. So, for example, if we had billionaire Warren Buffett sit at this table right now, I could say, on average, everyone at this table is worth $250 million. That's an average. So if you look at individual states and you look at what's going on, North Dakota, huge boom. They found oil. Can you say that that's a right to, the reason for that is right to work? I would say that's disingenuous. Texas, the same situation. If you look at Oklahoma, their growth the last 13 years has been 1.3, another. So you really have to look at individual states and what's going on in those states, not averages.
But here's a follow-up question for you. As a student of Charles Franklin's polls at MU, and in recently, let me get it right, the Terrence Group had a poll in December. It showed fairly widespread, it showed a majority of respondents backing a right-to-work law in Wisconsin. Are you bucking public opinion?
Well, one, the poll is almost 2 months old. And then secondly, if, in politics we know there's polls and then there's push polls. The push polls are when you know what you want to get as the answer. And if you look at those questions, and I look, do you feel like you should have freedom or be forced? I mean, really, that's not a legitimate poll. And so if you... But again, if you want to slant the questions to get the answers, and is paid for by the folks looking for their answer they're looking for, of course they're going to get inflated numbers.
Scott, please.
Well, that's pretty rich, just coming from the group that paid a professor at Marquette University to put out a report that says if you have a right to work in your state, workers are more likely to die, which is absolutely absurd. But yeah, so we had the Terrence Group, which is a nationally respected polling firm, conduct a poll, and we asked the question straight up: do you think workers should be allowed to choose whether or not to join a union, or should we keep the current law that requires them to be in a union if there's a union at their place of work? And it ended up being a 73% to 20% issue in support of right to work, giving workers the freedom to choose. But then we gave both positive and negative messages about right to work, including the messages that unions often say about it that we don't agree with, about lower wages, and it's not fair because they're being represented for free in a free ridership. And even after giving voters those pieces of negative information, we asked the question again, and it only moved slightly to 69% supporting right to work and 6% opposing. And that's not, you can disparage the poll all you want, but that's consistent with national polling that Gallup does. Gallup did a poll this summer, as they do, I think, almost every year, and their poll found even stronger support nationally for right to work, including when asked the question, if you yourself were allowed to vote for right to work, would you do it? And 71% of the people in the United States would personally vote for right to work. And I think that's because we are fundamentally a country that was founded on the principles of individual freedom and individual liberties, and giving people their own choice about which groups they want to belong to and how they spend their money.
Is there quickly?
I'm glad we touched upon the issue of transparency, because my coalition that started roughly less than 2 months ago and has swelled into almost 400 members from around the state, private businesses, they've been very transparent. They actually had to sign a document that said, we're part of the coalition and we're going to be outspoken, even if the media or some of the folks beat them up on this issue. We feel that passionately about it. WMC came out with a poll in July of this past year and asked their members, what's the most important thing to you? And only 15% of their members said right to work. I think another reason why it wasn't in any of the campaigns. So my question is, we've been very transparent on who we are, but we can't find who this 15% is.
Well,
so
can I respond to that?
Sure.
That was 15% who said right to work is the most important issue among like 8. Right to work in that survey of our members was the second most important overall.
At 15%.
No, 15% said it was the most important
Correct.
issue. We just did another survey of our membership in December, and 81% of our members said we should work on passing a right to work law, and only 6% said we shouldn't. There is very, very strong support within the business community for doing this, and I think it's awfully nice that and let's be clear, your group isn't just businesses; it's labor unions too.
It's large businesses, and
labor unions.
We go from 30 to thousands of people in our Michael's pipeline. If you go look at the businesses, they're large businesses. Many of them used to be WMC members.
Are unions members of your coalition, Steve?
No. Let me look at the list. Who are you saying that's a member of our list?
Well, you've described it as a
private. It's
so
a private.
Unions aren't funding your group at all.
No, our members are funding us.
So
our members.
No union.
My question to you is, who are these 15%? Can you name one CEO that will be public?
It's actually 81%
so that is a no.
of our members. Well, here's the thing. 4 years ago, we had a really important debate about collective bargaining in this state, and I don't know, maybe Steve's group and the businesses in his group didn't support that legislation, which gave right to work to public employees. But our members did, and our members were threatened, not only threatened, but were actually protested, not because they supported the bill, but simply because they and their employees gave campaign donations to Governor Walker. And so one of the things that our members learned, unfortunately, the hard way, is that when you come out in support of a point of view that involves a labor issue, labor unions will engage in retribution against you. And so, sorry.
I think if you're passionate about
Mr.
your position,
Lyons doesn't,
we've taken our members have been ridiculed and attacked by various media folks. So I get that, but they feel passionate enough to come out from behind the curtain and say, I know I'm going to have to answer to these questions, but I'm passionate, it's the right thing to do, so I'm going to put my name behind my position. So whether you want to say 15% but not say who they are, okay.
Here's my question. Is there a shadow of Act 10 over this debate? And here's why I ask. I was at a press conference with Senate Majority Leader Fitzgerald, and he said, I understand that one of the reasons that the governor calls it a distraction is he doesn't want another set of massive protests. If the Senate, now Speaker Voss has said the Senate's got to go first, number one. Speaker Voss has also said, I believe there's enough votes in the Assembly to pass a right to work law. So my question is, if the Senate considers it, are we going to look for massive protests?
Not from my group.
Not from your group.
My group is private sector businesses that employ thousands of people. Some of them as small as 30, some thousands. This is not what we do. These are private sector job creators. So, they can be ridiculed by WMC, but these are big businesses. Some of them, again, were WMC members at one time. And so, no, is there concern about Act 10 protests?
Yeah.
I think that's always on the back of a lot of legislative minds, but it's not something that we would do or support.
Is the specter of Act 10, like massive protests, part of WMC's consideration?
Well, I think certainly there are a lot of lawmakers in the building that went through the Act 10 protests 4 years ago. Do I think there would be protests? I think there would be. If you look at what happened in Indiana and Michigan, there were protests when they passed right to work. They weren't nearly of the scale or intensity that Act 10 was. And I think right to work would similarly not be of the scale or intensity in terms of the union protests. And I think that's largely because with Act 10, I think arguably you were taking something away from workers. You were restricting their collective bargaining privileges, and you were requiring them to pay more for their pension benefits and their health care benefits. Public sector workers.
Sure.
But with right to work, you're actually giving something to workers. You're giving them the freedom of choice. Do you want to pay dues? Do you allow workers to make a judgment about, do I think I'm getting value out of this union or not? And in our poll, which I would argue oversampled union households, because our poll had about 23% of the respondents statewide were union households. In our poll, 51% of union households supported giving workers the freedom to choose, with only 40% saying we want to keep the current law that forces us to pay dues.
There's a nuance in this.
So I think this is a very different dynamic here, Steve, because you've got, I think, even rank and file union members having a very different point of view on right to work than public employee union members had with respect to Act 10.
Do you want to get quickly, because yeah. I've got a...
So a couple different things. One is the legislature is dealing with some very significant challenges. We have a $2 billion deficit. The road funding is woefully underfunded. The debate over a Milwaukee Bucks arena, schools.
K-12, healthcare.
It goes on and on. And the finance numbers right now are not good. So they're looking at real things to spur this economy. They're looking at real things that are going to create jobs. They're looking at solutions. And I think that's why the governor has said it's a distraction. And whether the union protests, I think that would be yet another distraction on building our economy, creating more jobs. And that's why I think Speaker Voss has said this is our forward plan on different ways to create and build our economy. And again, that's why right to work's not there.
But he's also said it has to start in the Senate, because I believe there's votes in the Assembly. But I want to ask about another nuance in this that I truly don't understand. I think it's the operating engineers maintains that if we pass a right to work law, some groups, maybe their group, the operating engineers, could be exempt. Would it be legal if we had a right to work law to exempt any group, Scott?
I think it's questionably legal. Certainly it's something that we wouldn't support, and it's not something that I think makes sense, because you're either in favor of right to work and giving workers the freedom to choose, or you're not. I think let's look at the experience in Indiana, and they actually debated carving out trade unions in Indiana. Ultimately, didn't do it. But Mr. Lyons has said that this would be a distraction. Let me tell you about the kind of distraction right to work has been in Indiana since they passed their law. Their state economic development group has gotten over 100 commitments, signed commitments from businesses looking to invest in their state, who indicated that their status as a right to work state has now influenced their decision. Those 100 businesses are now, again, are signed commitments, over 10,000 new jobs for their state coming along, as well as $3.4 billion worth of investment. I mean, that's the kind of distraction I think some of us would like to have in Wisconsin. I don't think it's a distraction. I think it's a great economic development
Steve,
tool.
are any of your members seeking an exemption?
No, we haven't really discussed it. We have come out in opposition to right to work. So the creation of this private sector job creators has come out in opposition to right to work. So it's not something that we've discussed. Again, our focus has been defeating this legislation. I do want to take just one moment. Wisconsin already is below the national average when it comes to wages. That's fact. I don't think we dispute that. One of the things that we're dealing with, and I agree with the governor on this, is he said Wisconsin doesn't have a jobs problem. We have plenty of jobs. If you go to the wisconsin.gov job site, we have over 70,000 jobs that need to be filled, many of them by skilled trades. If you look at the vast majority of polls, whether you're for or polls, papers, if you're for or against right to work, the vast majority will state that wages will be lower, less health benefits, and less retirement. If we're going to fill all of these jobs, where are we going to get these folks if we're going to say, stay in Wisconsin, we already have a brain drain problem, stay in Wisconsin, but you're going to make less money, you're going to have less benefits or less health insurance, less retirement, or move to Wisconsin, it's a great place to live, but you're going to make less money. I just don't think that's the right economic message to send. And I think that's another reason why politicians on both sides of the aisle are scratching their heads and saying, you know, not now.
I know Scott well enough to know he would like to talk. He would like to answer that.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, worker shortages are certainly a problem, and he talked about wages. Look, everybody who predicted it, including this economist by the name of Laffer, who put out a study in 2011, which the study that Mr. Lyons' group just paid for actually references that study.
And there are many studies.
He predicted that Michigan and Indiana would have lower wages if they went right to work. And the exact opposite has actually happened in reality. Both Michigan and Indiana, and the Department of Labor puts out quarterly wage data, 4 times a year. Look at every single quarter, and you're going to see wage growth in those states. And by the way, Indiana is growing union jobs since passing right to work. But on the worker shortage issue, so from 2003 to 2012. You look at the United States Census Bureau data, and right-to-work states actually had 5 million net in-migration, where non-right-to-work states had net out-migration. And there's an awful lot of reasons why people move around. And I'm not here to say that the right-to-work states gained 5 million people because of right-to-work. But I'm going to go back to Gallup. They did a study nationally that asked what's the number one reason why you move your family from one place to another, and a lot of people would say it's probably weather. It's not weather. As weather was only 18%. The number one reason was for job and economic opportunity. And I would argue that right-to-work states have that.
Got a follow-up. I've now heard Senator Fitzgerald say twice, we haven't counted noses among the GOP senators. Are there the votes in the Senate to pass a right-to-work law?
We think there are. And I know that there are some senators who would prefer not to have to take the vote, right. And that's understandable. I mean, many of them were who are still in the Senate were around in 2011 during Act 10, and totally understand the reluctance to want to go through something like that again. But I don't think the right to work debate would be anything like Act 10 for a lot of reasons. And number one, the polling is very different. The public's with you already. Number two, it's not a fiscal issue. So you don't, part of what made Act 10 such a 3-ring circus is that the fiscal, because it was a fiscal issue, you needed a 20-vote quorum, which, as we all remember, the Democrats went down to Illinois and were able to paralyze the legislature for over a month. You don't have that with right to work. Right to work doesn't require that quorum. There's no running to Illinois to stop the bill.
Help me understand the governor's position. It's a distraction. But in 1993, as you're well aware, he co-sponsored a bill, a right-to-work bill, as a member of the Assembly. So when he says distraction, does that mean it would be a distraction from his all-but-announced presidential campaign, something he'd rather not deal with when he goes to South Carolina, Iowa, New Hampshire, etc.? Help me understand the governor, because push comes to shove, if it's on his desk, he's going to sign it, right, Mr. Manley?
We certainly hope he would, and we think he would, yeah.
Okay.
So the governor has said...
You're an old Capitol hand.
The governor said a number of times that the private sector unions are partners. And we're hearing this from Republicans and Democrats, Assembly and Senate. When we were meeting with them, I met with a senator the other day, and he said, I just toured the steam fitter's shop. It's impressive. And so, I think they're looking at ways to build the economy, but they're scratching their heads, and this is a solution looking for a problem. And I think that's been what we've been hearing when we meet with the politicians on both sides of the aisle. In regard to the governor, I'm not part of his campaign. I don't know. Again, I think they're looking at solid solutions to build our economy. and they have a plan. Again, the Assembly has their forward agenda that they've published. The governor is announcing bit by bit, and we'll hear more on February 3rd on what their plan is. And I think this debate over right to work is a distraction because it's not part of their agenda.
But he answered the question. I want you to answer the same question. If a right to work bill is on Governor Scott Walker's desk, does he sign it?
We don't know.
You don't know. Okay. Yesterday, Senator Darling, Representative Coinga, came out with an economic stimulus plan for the poorest neighborhoods, the 11 poorest zip codes in the city of Milwaukee. Part of that would be a right-to-work zone in the city of Milwaukee. How's that sound to WMC?
I think the only right-to-work zone we want to see is the entire state of Wisconsin. And I don't think it's fair to workers. I don't think it's fair to businesses to say we're going to implement this, what we think is a very important economic development policy, just for this individual tiny pocket in our state and not elsewhere. I don't think that's the right way to go.
Same position for your coalition, Steve?
From a different angle. I think, and I haven't discussed this with them, it was announced late yesterday, but again, the right to work debate, we've had the system in place and it's worked very well. Talking to my coalition members, private sector businesses, real job creators, if it's not broke, they don't want it fixed.
Well, I've heard Senator Fitzgerald as recently as yesterday said, I'm still interested in the issue. I understand there's just a press release from his office today saying this is going to be debated. When do you see it debated, Scott? As part of the budget or in the fall? Because I was there when Senator Fitzgerald said we can't touch this in an election year. So what's the window of some potential consideration in the Senate?
I don't think it's going to be a part of the budget. I think that the issue is too big and too important to be put in the budget. I think it's got to be
travel separately,
debated on its own, right? And I think that's going to happen before before summer, before the probably before July.
Okay, so you can see Senate GOP caucus at least discussing it prior to votes on the budget?
And I think voting on it.
Voting on it. Any thought on the timetable?
I would agree that I don't think it should be part of the budget. In regard to whether they take it up or not, if they take it up, I think it would be in the spring, but that's yet to be seen as well.
Okay, maybe one final topic, because I heard you on public radio on this issue today. Representative Rob Hutton is sponsoring a bill to repeal the prevailing wage. Is there any linkage or synergy between the right to work and the prevailing wage? Steve, you were on public radio.
We came out, and again, we're still looking at the details of that, and always, as you know, in politics, the devil's in the details. So we're looking at this closely. We're having experts look at that. At first glance, this is something we would oppose.
And is WMC interested in, if it can't get right to work, passing Hutton's bill repealing the prevailing wage, excuse me?
I think they're two very different issues with two very different objectives, and right now we're focused on passing right to work. We haven't done a real deep dive look into Representative Hutton's bill. I've seen some of the numbers about how much money they believe can be saved by taxpayers to do prevailing wage, and some of that's intriguing. But from our perspective, they're totally separate, and our focus remains right now on right to work.
Okay. Closing statement. Steve, you go first. We shouldn't have a right to work law because?
Again, we don't have a jobs problem. We have a workforce problem. And like the governor has said, and we completely agree with the governor on that point. We agree with the governor that it's a distraction. We need to find ways to fill those 70,000 jobs, and lowering wages, reducing their benefits, reducing their retirement is not the way to fill those 70,000 jobs.
And the final word on the issue, Wisconsin needs a right to work law, Mr. Manley?
Because it's the right thing to do for workers, because it's got strong support by the public on a bipartisan basis, I would note. And we think when you look at the economic statistics that you find with right to work states in terms of job growth and wage growth, it's a compelling pattern, and it's something that we think would be a net economic benefit to our state.
Very important issue. I think it will be debated at some point. And so I want to thank Scott Manley of WMC and Steve Lyons, lobbyist for the Wisconsin Contractor Coalition, for coming in to
Thanks for having us.
Stir the debate a little bit more. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you.